Well, former Northern Territory Chief Minister Adam Giles says he can't remember being told of failures within the state's youth incarceration system. Now, Mr Giles has been giving evidence to the Royal Commission into youth detention. Georgia Hitch joins us now from Darwin. Now, Georgia, we know that Mr Giles didn't seem to offer much in terms of answers earlier. Has he been more forthcoming this afternoon?
Yes, well, Fauzia, this morning we heard a lot of I don't recalls from Mr Giles, and he did get a bit of a rap over the knuckles this afternoon from some of the people cross-examining him about that. They asked him, you know, this was a commission that he set up. Why didn't he come prepared? He hasn't prepared a statement. He didn't seem to go back through any documents that he was being asked about, and his response was that he intended to come here to be completely transparent and to ask any questions, to answer any questions that were asked of him. And he said also that he hasn't been watching any of the evidence that's been given to the commission. He hasn't been watching it streamed online and hasn't been keeping up with the news. So he did get criticised a little bit for his lack of participation in that regard. But other than that, we have heard a little bit more from him this afternoon. In his cross-examination, he's been asked about the Four Corners report that ultimately led to the commission. And one of the interesting pieces of information he shared is that he had never seen the footage that was featured in the Four Corners report before seeing it on television, and that it really shocked him. He was really quite taken aback by some of the things that he saw, and that he also didn't realise that some of that vision was quite historical. He thought it had all happened in the last 6 months, and he said that some of the comments he made immediately after the Four Corners report, that he had been in a government that was working to cover up what had been happening, was wrong, and that had he known that some of those incidents and some of the footage had happened under the previous Labor government, then he wouldn't have made those comments. But quite interestingly, one of the pieces of footage that was arguably one of the most confronting images, and I think that was seen by some of the reactions to the Four Corners report afterwards, was that image of Dylan Voller in the restraint chair. And surprisingly, Adam Giles, when he was asked about that, said that he wasn't confronted by that. This is exactly what he had to say.
One of the images on that television show was a picture of Dylan Voller in a spit hood sitting in a restraint chair. Did that shock you?
No.
Oh, that wasn't a shocking image?
No, because we'd been briefed about, when the legislation went through, I think we'd been briefed about the need for spit hoods to protect some of the prison officers who'd been spat on and potential transfer of disease and so forth.
And Adam Giles went on to say that that spit hood and the restraint chair were recommended by the Commissioner of Corrections at the time as the most appropriate measure to not only protect staff but also to protect detainees who they perceive to be a threat to themselves.
Now, Georgia, Mr Giles is currently being cross-examined. What else has he been asked about?
He's also been asked, and he's been asked this a number of times, about his stance on law and order and this idea that his government was tough on crime. It's a theme that keeps coming up, that his government wanted to be seen to be penalising juvenile offenders by locking them away and being tough on their sentencing. And it's something that he said earlier today and was asked about again, that he wasn't for, and that this idea that his government was tough on crime wasn't true. It wasn't a government policy. It was a statement that he might have made, and that he was really for diversion programs and for keeping people out of the detention centre. But he was asked in cross-examination by one of the lawyers for a vulnerable witness about comments he's made previously, where he said if he were Corrections Minister, he said that he wouldn't like to be, but if he were, he would throw all prisoners into a concrete hole, even though it would breach the conventions of the UN Convention for Prisoners. And he said that those comments were wrong. He said that they reflected the views of the community at the time, and that he didn't agree with them now. So some, I guess, a bit of discrepancy between his views on that law and order issue and tough on crime. The other thing that he's been asked about, and Commissioner McGooder actually asked him about this, was where the line is in terms of what incidents he would expect to be reported to him by the Minister for Corrections. Because earlier today we've heard in his statements and in his evidence that he doesn't recall ever being told by his minister about some of the conditions at the youth detention centres and some of the incidents. And so this question was about, well, what would have set the bar as it should be reported to you? And what was bad enough to be reported? What about a death in custody? Would you expect that to be reported to you? And he replied that he wouldn't expect a death in custody to be reported to him. He said that he had confidence in his former Minister for Corrections, John Elfrink, and that if things weren't being brought to him, then he assumed that they were under control. But he also added onto that he wasn't ever really 100% satisfied with the way that urgent information was delivered to him, and that often he read about these incidents in the media before he received a briefing.
Georgia Hitch, thank you for that report.